Hello, everyone, and welcome to Chapter 8, Cognition, Language, and Creativity. I'm going to start by reading a passage from the book from Chapter 8 called Capturing the Wind. William Kawamba grew up in a rural village in Malawi, the second eldest of 7 children. He had to leave school at the age of 14 because his parents weren't able to afford the $80 fee. Rather than sitting idle, though, William borrowed books from the village library and set about continuing his education at home. One of the books he brought home was an 8th grade American physics textbook with a picture of a wind turbine on its cover. William was fascinated and imagined how he could use the book's ideas to build a windmill that would provide power to his family home. Using plans from the book as his guide, his first windmill was constructed from a broken bicycle, a tractor fan blade, a pulley, a blue gum tree. And though people in the village initially thought he was crazy, they quickly changed their minds when they realized that the windmill was powering 4 light bulbs and 2 radios. William's story, told in the book The Boy Who Harnessed the Wind, is a testament to the power of human cognition, or thinking, problem solving, and creativity. But William's success also raises important questions for psychological scientists. How do we think? How do we make decisions? And how are we able to solve problems? How do people create works of art, science, and literature? In this chapter, we'll attempt to answer these questions by exploring a broad range of human cognition, from detailed-oriented decision-making to innovative, creative visions. Just a few things to consider before we begin. When someone is described as creative, what is the first thing that comes to your mind? How do we define creativity or people and creativity? How do you quickly solve routine problems? Does this process require a degree of creativity? Why or why not? After reading Chapter 8 and listening to this video, you should be able to do the following things. Distinguish between experiential and reflective processing, explain how imagery is used in thinking. We'll also talk about concepts used in thinking and how language is used. Distinguish between 4 methods of problem solving, algorithms, understanding, heuristics, and insight. And of course, we have other things that I'll show you on the screen here you can read. But as you can tell, again, this is another very detailed and interesting chapter. So let's begin with a short video.
Welcome, students and fellow enthusiasts of psychology, to the summary of Chapter 8, Cognition, Language and Creativity, by Kuhn, Mitterer and Martini. This video was created for your educational journey by Professor of Psychology Jeffrey Hastings. As we immerse ourselves in this enriching video summary, we aim to glean profound insights into the workings of the human mind, mental imagery, problem solving, and the process of creative thinking. Have you ever pondered the intricacies of how your brain receives, stores and recalls information? The remarkable complexity and creative logic inherent in the human brain render it unparalleled and superior to artificial intelligence. Consider the profound intricacy of human thought processes. Our brains are ceaselessly abuzz, processing information through 2 distinct modes, experiential and reflective. This indomitable creative capacity underscores the irreplaceable value of human creativity, which stands as a testament to the unparalleled depth of our cognitive prowess. Picture this. You're at a coffee shop. The aroma of freshly brewed coffee wafts through the air. You instinctively decide to order your regular, a cappuccino. That's experiential processing, where your brain makes quick, intuitive decisions based on past experiences. Now imagine you're faced with a challenging math problem. You can't just rely on instinct here, can you? No. You'll need to engage in reflective processing, where you'll systematically analyze the problem, perhaps even jot down a few equations. It's a slower, more deliberate thought process. So whether you're making a snap decision or methodically working through a problem, your brain switches between these 2 modes of cognition. So the way we process information can be as simple as deciding what to eat for breakfast or as complex as solving a math problem. Do you believe that a picture is worth 1,000 words? Well, it seems our brains might agree with that. Imagery in our minds plays a crucial role in thinking, often acting as a mental shortcut to understanding complex concepts. Imagine a vivid sunflower or a roaring lion. These images instantly conjure a wealth of information, making it easier for us to grasp and remember. However, as we move beyond simple imagery to forming conceptual rules, we must tread carefully. Concepts such as categorizing objects or events help us make sense of the world, yet they can sometimes be oversimplified, leading to misconceptions. Take social stereotypes, for example. These are essentially oversimplified concepts of groups of people that fail to acknowledge the diversity within those groups. Remember, concepts are powerful tools, but they can also be misleading if not used correctly. Ever found yourself stuck on a problem, unsure of how to proceed? You're not alone. When it comes to problem solving, there are 4 key methods: algorithms, understanding, heuristics, and insight. Algorithms are step-by-step procedures that guarantee a solution like a recipe. Understanding relies on grasping the underlying principles of a problem. Heuristics are mental shortcuts or rules of thumb that can speed up problem solving, while insight is that aha moment when the solution suddenly becomes clear. But beware, barriers like mental set or functional fixedness can interfere with our problem-solving efforts. But what about when we need to think outside the box? That's where creative thinking comes in. It's not just about coming up with novel ideas, it's also about being able to adapt and modify your thinking to fit the situation. This process often involves 5 stages: preparation, incubation, insight, evaluation, and elaboration. Creative personalities tend to be risk-taking, complex, open, driven, and self-confident. So the next time you're faced with a problem, remember these techniques and don't be afraid to get creative. But wait, there's more to the mind's capabilities than just cognition and creativity. Now, we're on the brink of unveiling the hidden depths of intelligence. Imagine a landscape populated with multiple types of intelligence, each with its unique characteristics. Intriguing, isn't it? And yet the measurement of this complex entity sparks endless debates among psychologists. What makes one intelligent? Is it a single factor or a combination of abilities? Stay tuned for the next journey into the fascinating world of intelligence.
Okay, we'll dive right into Unit 1, the basic units of cognition, mental imagery, concepts, and language. Cognition is a process of thinking, gaining knowledge, and dealing with knowledge. At its most basic, cognition refers to processing a mental representation or an internal subjective expression of a problem or situation. Human cognition can take many forms, from experiential daydreaming to more reflective problem solving and reasoning. Let's do some more experiential and reflective thinking while looking at that figure on the screen now. Is this face happy or sad? You know the face is happy just by looking at the photo. You are engaging in more or less unconscious, effortless, and automatic experiential processing. Now look at the next photo. What is the sum of these numbers? This time, experiential processing likely was not enough. You likely had to deliberately concentrate and engage in reflective processing. So a hint, when you look at these figures, of course, add the 10s first. The 10 plus 20 plus 50 plus 40 is 120. And then add the ones, 8 plus 9 plus 4 plus 2, and that's 23. So the 120 plus 23 would be 143. So reflective processing requires you to deliberately concentrate and engage in conscious thought. For example, my wife always teases me when we're checking out at the grocery store. I can usually guess how much we're going to spend on the groceries, give or take $5. You know, I can do this because I actively pay attention to how much the item costs and I compare it to other stores. Yes, I'm kind of a cheapskate, but in other words, I have to deliberately concentrate and engage in reflective processing to do that. So let's try one. I want you to start with, let's look at 8 divided by 2, parentheses 2 plus 2. What does that equal? Look at that for a moment. The proper way to do it is to start with the parentheses. Of course, take 2 plus 2 first, which is going to equal 4. And we have division and multiplication. And when you have operators from the same precedence, you work from the left to the right. So it would be 8 divided by 2, that equals 4. Then 4 times 4, it will equal 16. And with more complex problems, though, we see there's some clear limitations to human cognition. However, there are also some great strengths in our ability to think and reason. In the textbook, you read about the chess grandmaster who once simultaneously played 45 chess games while blindfolded. Do you remember how he did it? Like for most people, he effectively used three of the basic units of thought. That's mental images, concepts, and language, or actually symbols. Mental images are picture-like mental representations. So a concept, this is important to remember, a concept is a mental category for classifying things based on common features or properties. Language consists of words or symbols and rules for combining them. Thinking also involves all three units. For example, blindfolded chess players rely on visual images, concepts like, of course, Game 2 has started with a strategy called an English opening, and the notational system or language of chess. Let's take a closer look at these three basic units of cognition. You should be aware, though, that many of the ideas you've seen previously, you've read in the book, are also involved in cognition, including attention, pattern recognition, and even memory. But we'll talk more about that later. Mental imagery. Most of us use images to think, remember, and solve problems. For instance, we may use mental images to make a decision or solve a problem, like choose what clothes to wear or figure out how to arrange furniture in a room, for instance. Changing feelings or behaviors, we can think of if we don't like what we're thinking about or a behavior, we can think about pleasant images to get out of a bad mood, like imagining we're in perfect shape to stay on a diet or exercise training, or if we're in a bad mood, thinking about a place that's very relaxing on a beach, reading a book. Also, we may use mental images to improve a skill or prepare for some action. There's a lot of research that was done with people that they had one test group that was practicing free throws in basketball, and they threw 1,000 free throws, and another group with test B group, all they did was imagine themselves throwing and visualize themselves making the basket. And it was almost the same, the improvement between the two groups on the improvement in free throws. So it was pretty amazing and tells you the power of mental imagery. To better understand our capacity to create and use mental images, let's look at three of their characteristics. First, the mental images are not flat like photographs. I mean, they're more like mental images or our memories that our brain tries to process and fill in the gaps as we're trying to process information. Second, mental images often approximate what is true in the real world. Our ability to create images that are keeping with our environment becomes clear when we zoom in and out of actually mental images. And then third, mental images are held in short-term working memory. That's memory when they're active, and they're only active when we're actually thinking about it. They reside in that part of our working memory called the visuospatial sketch pad. That's important to kind of remember that too. Some people have difficulty when they use this visual imagery, like the techniques we're talking about, while other people that are very creative, like artists, architects, designers, sculptors, filmmakers, they have excellent visual imagery. And part of the brain in the visuospatial sketch, where is it located? And if you look at different psychological processes like rotating a mental image and working memory, they're not always easy to localize in the brain because they actually have been carried out by an interconnected collection of brain areas. I mean, there are several areas that may actually come into play. But roughly speaking, though, seeing something in your mind's eye is similar to seeing real objects. Information from the eyes normally activates the brain's primary visual area, creating an image. Other areas then help us recognize the image by relating it to prior knowledge that's actually stored in our long-term memory. So, if you look at the image just changed, when you see a flower, its image is represented by activity in the primary visual area of the cortex at the back of the brain. Information about the flower also is related to other brain areas. When you form a mental image, the system works in reverse. Brain areas in which memories are stored send signals actually back to the visual cortex, where once again an image is created. For example, if you visualize a friend's face right now, the area of your brain that specializes in perceiving faces will become more active. Also, there's kinesthetic imagery. kinesthetic imagery, in a sense, is when we think about our bodies as well as our brains. Kinesthetic meaning motor, the motor skills or movement, are created for muscular sensations. Those images help us think about movement and action. So an important thing to know about that, as you think and talk, kinesthetic sensations can guide the flow of our ideas. You have to think about that for a moment, but it's important to remember that for your quiz. For example, if your friend calls and asks you about a combination, say you loaned a lock out to her for her locker, you actually may have that mental imagery of the lock trying to move the combination as if you're actually twirling the lock to remember it. Or think about this for a moment. Which direction do you turn the hot water spigot handle in your kitchen or bathroom to shut the water off? If you haven't memorized the words lefty loosey and righty tighty, you may turn the faucet in your imagination before answering. You may even make a turning motion with your hand before answering. Kinesthetic images are especially important in movement-oriented skills like music, sports, dance, skateboarding, martial arts. An effective way to improve such skills is practice by rehearsing kinesthetic images of yourself performing flawlessly, like the basketball example I used earlier. Concepts. As noted previously, a concept is actually an idea that represents a category of objects or events. Concepts, they help us identify important features of things that we encounter in the world. That's why experts in various areas of knowledge, they're good at classifying objects, like bird watchers, 5-year-old dinosaur enthusiasts, and others all learn to look for identifying details that beginners tend to miss. If you're knowledgeable about a certain topic, let's say gymnastics, gaming or football, you literally see things in a conceptual category differently and when you're viewing that than less well-informed people do. Connecting this to what we learned in section 7.3, if you remember in the last chapter that you read, the long-term memory networks for concepts will be more elaborate for experts than non-experts. And of course, a lot of that has to do with your attention, your focus, and your interest in that subject matter. So about forming concepts, this is important for your quiz. Concept formation is the process of classifying information into meaningful categories for you. That's concept formation. At its most basic, concept formation is based on experience. It's another important thing. It's based on experience. You may recall that cognitive development, when we looked at some of those theories, it was documented that children acquire concepts through complex and ongoing process of assimilation. That's working new information into existing concepts. And accommodation, is creating new concepts with information when it does not fit with the existing information that you have. So just imagine for a moment, if you can, just think about a child trying to teach some child about what a dog is, for instance. You picture, you see a dog, a medium-sized dog, and say, there's a dog. And then you pass through another yard and the child sees a cat and says dog. And you're like, no, that's a cat. That's not a dog. Now the child thinks, okay, well, maybe then a cat is a smaller animal and a dog is a larger animal. And of course, then you go down a little further, you see some little small Pekingese dog and the child says cat. And you say, no, that's a dog. Of course, you're teaching, if you're just thinking about that, and that confusion is very understandable. But at first, they may confuse things based on size or some other similarity, but it's eventually, of course, they recognize everything just through these patterns and by putting them into categories. And that's the way we learn actually everything. As adults, we often acquire concepts by learning or forming conceptual rules, guidelines for deciding whether objects or events belong to that concept class or category. For example, a triangle, when we think of a triangle, must be a closed shape with 3 sides made of straight lines. Trying to develop rules for concepts won't always work, though. For example, it's unlikely that memorizing rules would allow a new listener to accurately categorize rhythm and blues, hip hop, rock, salsa, reggae, whatever, country. Clearly, while rules are an efficient way to learn concepts, concrete examples remain important. To get a sense of the importance of a concrete example in learning about concepts, consider what happens when you think about the concept of let's say a bird. Do you mentally list the features of the bird? Probably not. In addition to the rules and features, we may actually use what's called a prototype or a concrete example of an ideal model to identify the concept. A robin, for example, is a prototypical bird. An ostrich is not. In other words, some things are better examples of others. Now it's your turn to try this. Which of the drawings that you see on the slide represents a cup? So just kind of look at that for a moment, and which one is the best representation of a cup? At some point, as a cup grows taller and wider, does it really become a vase or a bowl? How do we know when the line is crossed? Probably we mentally compare objects to what we consider an ideal cup. Deciding if an object belongs to a conceptual class is aided by relating it to a prototype or an ideal example, as I mentioned earlier. So if you're a coffee drinker who thinks of a cup of coffee, you may think of picture number 5, or in my wife's case, number 3 for her morning latte. If you're a chef or love cooking, you may be thinking in terms of measurement of a cup and may select maybe number 2. If you're like most people, you would select number 5. Why? I'm really not entirely certain, but I trust the authors have done their homework, and they said participants in one experiment chose number 5 as the best cup. So I'm going to go with that. That's why it's hard to identify concepts when we can't come up with the relevant prototypes. We have nothing to use as a comparison. Wine tasting illustrates the encoding function of language. To communicate their experiences to others, wine connoisseurs must put taste sensations into words. My cousin Dean would say, the wine you see here is marked by deeply concentrated nuances of plum, blackberry, and currant with a nice balance of tannins and acid, building to a spicy oak finish as he's swirling it around. I would just say it tastes pretty good, and that's probably why I can't ever remember which wine to order at a restaurant, but I think you kind of get the picture. There are also faulty concepts or categories that you may use that can lead to some problems. One of the challenges associated with concepts, relates that they don't always accurately reflect reality. Using such faulty concept often leads to thinking errors. This is important to remember. For example, like social stereotypes, they're oversimplified concepts of groups of people that do not properly account for the diversity of people within that category. So you can imagine the problem with stereotyping and having this conceptual rule or this place you're trying to just put these people in a box. It doesn't work that. Stereotypes have a major impact on social behavior, and they frequently contribute to prejudice and discrimination. A related problem is kind of an all or nothing thinking, like one-dimensional thought. In this case, when people do this, you classify things as absolutely right or wrong, good or bad, fair or unfair. And the truth is, there are very few things that are black and white. Thinking this way prevents us from appreciating the subtlenesses of most of the problems that we confront in everyday life. Language. As we have seen, thinking may occur without language. Of course, everyone has searched for a word to express an idea that exists as a vague image or feeling. Nevertheless, most thinking relies heavily on language because words encode or translate the world and our thoughts about the world into symbols that are easy to manipulate. The structure of language. What does it take to make a language? First, a language must provide symbols that stand for objects and ideas. The symbols we call words are built on phonemes, which are basic speech sounds, and morphemes, which speech sounds are collected into meaningful units, such as syllables. For instance, in English, the sound M, B, W, and A cannot form a syllable, MBWA, mumba. In Swahili, they can. Animals around the world make pretty much the same sounds, but notice, however, how various languages use slightly different morphemes to express the sound that a duck makes. Next, a language must have a grammar or set of rules for making sounds into words or words into sentences. One part of grammar, known as syntax, concerns rules for word order. Syntax is important because rearranging words almost always changes the meaning of a sentence. Consider the difference between dog bites man versus man bites dog. Traditional grammar is concerned with surface language, the sentences we actually speak. In contrast, linguist Noam Chomsky has focused on the unspoken rules that we use to change core ideas into various sentences. He believed that we do not learn all the sentences we may ever say. Rather, we actively produce them by applying transformation rules to universal core patterns. Kind of makes sense. We use these rules to change a simple declarative sentence to other voices or forms like past tense, passive voice, and so forth. For example, the core sentence, man rides horse, can be transformed to, in the past, the man rode the horse. Passive, the horse was ridden by the man. Negative, the man did not ride the horse. Or a question, did the man ride a horse? Or if you want a more non-stereotypical answer from the book, the woman rode the horse while the man stayed at home to clean the house and take care of the children. I'm just saying. So for the test, the thing that you have to know about language there is the connotative meaning of language or of a word is what the word means to the individual based on their experiences. It's important to know that. And that's when we get into the differences in diversity and the different places around the world, that words, even though they may be the same, could have different meanings based on experiences. And now we're going to look at semantics. Semantics is just a study of meaning of the words and language. There's a denotative meaning, the exact dictionary definition, and connotative meaning, I mentioned earlier, is an emotional or it's your personal meaning to that word based on your experiences. Alternative languages. Contrary to common belief, language is not limited to speech and text, nor is it restricted to humans. In this section, we'll explore gestural languages such as American Sign Language and animals' use of language. Gestural language. Take a moment to consider the case of, used in the book, it was Ildefonso, I think was the name, a young man who was born deaf at the age of 8. He never communicated with another human except by mime. Then at last, he had a breakthrough. After much hard work with sign language, with a sign language teacher, he understood the link between a cat and the gesture for it. At that magic moment, he grasped the idea of cat and how it could be communicated to another person just by signing the word. American Sign Language, or ASL, is a gestural language made all this breakthrough possible. ASL is a true language like German, Spanish, Japanese. In fact, people who use other gestural languages such as French Sign, Mexican Sign, or Old Kentish Sign may not easily understand American Sign Language, or ASL. Although ASL has spatial grammar, syntax, and semantics all on its own, both speech and signing follow similar universal language patterns. So an important thing to know on the test, of course, that semantics just means the study of meaning in words and language. You know, signing children pass through the stages of language development at about the same age as speaking children. Some psychologists now believe that speech evolved from gestures far back in human and primate history. Do you ever make hand gestures when you're speaking on the phone? You know, if so, you may be displaying a remnant of the gestural origins of language. Perhaps that's also why the same brain areas become more active when a person speaks or signs. ASL has only about 3,000 root signs compared with roughly 600,000 words in English. However, variations in signs make ASL a highly expressive language. For example, the sign look at can be varied in ways to mean look at me, look at her, look at each, stare at, gaze, watch, look for a long time, look again and again, reminisce, sightsee, look forward to, predict, anticipate. You get the idea, and many other variations. Infants can express the idea, pick me up in gestures before they can make the same request in words. Their progression from gestures to speech may mirror the evolution of human language abilities. Sign language naturally arises out of the need to communicate visually, but they also embody a personal identity and define distinct community. Those who speak sign share not just a language, but a rich culture as well. Animal language. Do animals use language? Animals in the wild definitely communicate. The cries, gestures, and mating calls of animals have broad meanings immediately understood by other animals of the same species. For the most part, however, natural animal communication is quite limited. What about trying to teach animals or language to animals? Are you smarter than a dog? I mean, I think about it all the time. When I tell my dog to come, he comes. I tell her to, or and him and her to sit, they sit. To stay, they stay. They bark. I have no idea what they're talking about. But what about a chimpanzee? There have been a lot of studies relating us, of course, humans to our closest, animal is a chimpanzee. Are we smarter than chimpanzees? And if we are, how much smarter are we than chimpanzees? To this point, there are numerous like chimps and gorillas, as well as other assortment of dolphins, sea lions, parrots, have been taught to communicate with word symbols or by various hand gestures. The champion is it's a pygmy chimpanzee. You may have seen this chimp on the internet named Kanzi, who was taught to communicate by pushing buttons on a computer keyboard and also testing and competing against very smart humans to see if they actually could memorize or learn faster than humans. So what do you think about that? So Kanzi's sentences consistently followed correct word order like a child learning language. The chimpanzee picked up some rules from his caregivers. However, he's developed other patterns on his own. For example, Kanzi usually places action symbols in the order that he wants to carry them out, such as chase, tickle, or chase, hide. In these respects, Kanzi's vocabulary and ability to invent a simple grammar on par with the 2-year-olds. After more than 30 years of training, Kanzi's language use is certainly noteworthy and may yet help us better understand the roots of human language. On the other hand, Noam Chomsky insists if chimps were biologically capable of language, they would use it on their own. And that does make a good point. Kanzi's language learning has been impressive. He can comprehend spoken English words. He can identify lexigram symbols when he hears corresponding words. He can use lexicograms when the objects to identify they refer to are absent. And he can, if asked, lead someone to the object. All of these skills were acquired through observation, not conditioning. Findings like these lend support to the linguistic relativity hypothesis, the idea that the words we use not only reflect our thoughts, but can shape them as well. So now we're going to look at bilingualism. Wouldn't it be better to be able to speak more than one language? It would certainly reduce the likelihood of miscommunication across cultures if each of us could speak numerous languages, or we use, of course, Google Voice. However, such abilities can bring personal benefits as well. Consider, for example, bilingualism, the ability to speak our 2 languages. The recent large-scale studies suggest bilingualism is not directly associated with executive functions or other cognitive abilities. Being able to speak another language may help with employment opportunities and expands our opportunities to interact with other people. Unfortunately, millions of minority American children who do not speak English at home experience subtractive bilingualism. Immersed in English-only classrooms in which they're expected to sink or swim, they usually end up losing some of their native language skills. Such children risk becoming less than fully competent in both their first and second languages. In addition, they tend to fall behind educationally. As they struggle with English, their grasp of arithmetic, social studies, science, and other subjects also may suffer. In short, English-only instruction can leave them poorly prepared to succeed in the minority culture. For the majority of children who speak English at home, the picture can be quite different because learning a second language is almost always beneficial and poses no threat to the child's home language. This has been called additive bilingualism because learning a second language adds to the child's overall competence. So in Unit 2, problem solving, we all solve problems every day. This is kind of a fun section too, because we're going to kind of test and maybe get some ideas on how to improve our own problem solving. It could be as common as figuring out how to make non-poisonous meals out of leftovers, or as significant as developing a cure for cancer. How do we solve such problems? A good way to start is actually to solve a problem. So we're going to give a few a try. So write this down on your notepad or just look at the screen and try to take some notes and see if you can figure out the answer to this problem. And this was in the text, so you may have already looked at it. I'm going to read the text. Just keep these things in mind. Santiago got the surprise of his life. He had anchored his little motorboat 10 miles from an island and gone snorkeling. He returned to the boat only to discover that 2 seals had been settled in for a quick nap. He climbed into the boat and immediately began to cruise toward the island at 7 miles per hour. Just then, the 2 seals woke up and they jumped out into the water and also swam toward the island. At the same instant, Santiago's friend left the island in a sailboat at 3 miles per hour, coming out to the rendezvous with the motorboat. The seals swam back and forth between each one of the boats, the motorboat and the sailboat, at a speed of 12 miles per hour until they met. How far will the seals have swum when the 2 boats meet? This is like an SAT or some intellectual exam or questionnaire. And it's real important to kind of understand, even if you understand how these questions are framed, it may help you on these tests. So if you don't immediately know the answer to the problem, we're going to come back to it in a moment. We're going to talk about insight. Methods of problem solving. No matter what form a problem takes, it's usually best that you face it mindfully or cognitively. However, there are a number of methods that you could use to successfully solve a problem. On this slide, we're going to outline 4 of them, actually on 2 slides. One of them is going to be algorithms, then there's understanding, heuristics, and then on the next slide, we're going to talk about insight. So let's look at algorithms. For routine problems, an algorithmic solution is achieved by following a series of basically step-by-step guidelines or rules, and that's usually enough to solve the problem. Simple example of an algorithm is a step that you add up the numbers like in the previous chapter, whether you did it in your head or a calculator. But another example is like we talked about the lock. If you forget a combination of a lock, you can start thinking about it systematically, trying to think of all possible combinations, and that may take a while. So to kind of shortcut, you can create an algorithm, and it's an example of a logical thought proceeding from given information to new conclusions on the basis of explicit rules. To do this, we can add that logical thought may be inductive thought. That means going from specific facts or observations to general principles, or deductive thought is going from general principles to specific situations. Becoming a problem-solving expert in any field involves, at minimum, becoming familiar with the algorithms that are available actually in that field. So let's talk about understanding. Many problems cannot be solved through algorithms. In such cases, first off, you have to have an understanding. And actually, all these problems, you need to understand what the problem is. And that's a deeper comprehension of the problem, and it becomes necessary. So we're going to try to solve this problem. This is in the book. It's called the tumor problem. If a person has an inoperable stomach tumor, there's a device that's used that produces rays at high intensity that actually is going to destroy all the tissue, both healthy and diseased, wherever it goes through in your body. How can you use this ray and destroy the tumor while minimizing damage to the surrounding healthy tissue? In the image on this slide, you see it's kind of a schematic representation of Dunker's tumor problem. At the right end is an ellipse with a smaller ellipse at its center. The inner ellipse represents the tumor, and the outer ellipse represents healthy tissue. A rectangular device at the left is shown to pass a ray on the larger ellipse that cuts across the inner ellipse and then emerges out at the right of the larger ellipse. How can the tumor, how can it be destroyed without injuring too much of the surrounding tissue? And this German psychologist, it's Karl Dunker, and that's why it's called Dunker's tumor problem. He gave college students this problem in a class in a series of studies. He asked them to think loud as they worked, and he listened to their responses as each one of them did this. He found that successful students first had to discover the general properties of a correct solution. A general solution defines the requirements for success, but not in enough detail to guide further action. It's actually that phase was complete when the students realized that the intensity of the rays for this example had to be lowered on their way to the tumor, causing less damage. Then in the second phase, they proposed a number of functional solutions or workable solutions, and then selected kind of the best one. That's what his best students did. One solution was to focus the weak rays on the tumor from several angles. Another was to rotate the person's body to minimize exposure to the healthy and important tissue, bodily tissue. The other thing in problem solving is heuristics. Imagine that you're traveling to Washington, D.C., and you decide to look up an old friend that works in the FBI, and the name is Penelope Garcia. You search on an online directory and you find dozens of P. Garcias that are listed. Of course, you could follow an algorithm such as dialing each number in alphabetical order until you find the right one. Or alternatively, you could use a heuristic. And that's a shortcut or kind of a rule of thumb, they call it, for finding a solution to a problem. Typically, heuristic reduces the number of alternatives that thinkers must consider. So it's going to shorten that outcome if you can think of these heuristics. You could, for example, in this example, you simplify the problem of looking up where she lived, and then you would narrow your search using this random search strategy. So it's important to know that this is an example of trial and error thinking, in which some possibilities are tried more or less randomly. Forget it. You say to yourself, is there a better way I can narrow the search? Oh yeah, I remember hearing that Penelope lives near work. Then you Google a map and call only the numbers with addresses in, let's say, Southern Washington near to Quantico for an FBI facility. Expert problem solvers are good at using heuristic strategies like these. So try to identify the current state of affair. It differs from the desired goal. Then they find the steps that will reduce the difference. Here's another strategy. Try working backward from the goal, the desired goal, to the starting point or current state that you're in now. Another strategy. If you can't reach the goal directly, try to identify intermediate goals or sub-problems that at least get you a little bit closer and maybe answer a few questions that will help lead to your goal. Another strategy, a heuristic strategy, is represent the problem in another way, like with graphs, diagrams, analogies. Generate possible solutions and then test it. Doing so will eliminate a lot of the alternatives, or it may clarify what's needed for a solution. One important point to remember about heuristics, though, it's although they raise the odds of success, they're not going to guarantee the correct solution. All right, let's return to the problem of the boat and the seals that I talked about a few moments ago. The best way to solve this problem is by using insight, what's referred to as insight. And insights are usually based on reorganizing a problem. And this is what you do a lot of say SAT questions or these IQ tests. This allows you to see problems in new ways and makes the solutions actually seem obvious. So first, you need to narrow down the information to what is known. This happens in a lot of testing atmospheres. They're going to throw in a lot of irrelevant information that does not matter to kind of confuse you or slow you down. So you narrow it down to the information that's known. First off, what do you know? He had anchored his motorboat 10 miles from the island, so he's 10 miles away. He began to cruise toward the island at 7 miles per hour to go back home. At 7 miles per hour, he's 10 miles away. The two seals woke up, jumped in the water, and also swam toward the island. At the same instant, his friend left the island in a sailboat at 3 miles per hour. And then, of course, the seals swim back and forth between the boats at a speed of 12 miles per hour. So they're going faster than both the boats, and they can actually go to one, then go to the other one. And here's what you find when we talk about trying to solve this problem, the way that we're looking at it. And of course, we're using our insight here. The boats are actually, he is 10 miles away and the other boat is at the dock, they're 10 miles from each other. So we know that. One boat is traveling at 7 miles per hour. The other boat is traveling at 3. They will have gone 10 miles in 1 hour because one's going 10. You add that 7 plus the 3 is 10. And the trip, and that means if they've gone 10 miles in 1 hour, they will cover a 10, and it's a 10-mile trip. It's going to take exactly 1 hour to make this trip or to meet. The seal now is swimming 12 miles an hour. So how many miles will the seals swim? The only thing you have to know is they're swimming 12 miles in an hour. This is a 1 hour trip. They're going to swim 12 miles. See how that's where, if you get down into the part of this and you start trying to solve the math, you still may get to that answer. It's just going to take you a long period of time. If you immediately can pick up that they're traveling 10 miles and they're going, and you know the 7 plus 3 is a 10, so they're going to travel 10 miles and per hour, you know that it's 1 hour quickly. So you can just answer that question very easily and without having a lot of math to help you solve it. So insight, we look at that. Once again, insight is to solve a problem, usually based on reorganizing a problem. And then we have psychologist Janet Davidson believes that insight involves 3 different abilities. The first is selective encoding. That refers to selecting information that is relevant to the problem while ignoring distractions. Like in that problem, we just selected the information that we need. And here's another example, just to give you one. If you now look at that, another example in the book said that you have black socks and white socks in your drawer. And there's a ratio of 4 to 5, say 4 black socks, 5 white socks. How many socks are you going to have to pick if you're blindfolded, let's say, to ensure that you have a pair that's the same color? You know, if you realize that the mixed ratio of 4 to 5 doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if it's 100 to 1. Think about how the question was asked. It actually, how many socks are you going to have to pull up to guarantee that you have 2 socks that are going to match? There are only 2 colors. So you're going to pull out one. Doesn't matter if it's black or white. Pull out another one. Doesn't matter if it's black or white. Pull out a third. It can't be not black or white. You only have 2 colors. So the answer to that is 3 socks. That's the most that you would have to try to guarantee that you would have a match. Then we talk about selective combination. And that actually is bringing together seemingly unrelated bits of useful information. And the example they had in the book is, try to solve this problem. You have 2 hourglasses. One is a 7-minute hourglass, and the second one is an 11-minute hourglass. And you have to use your hourglass as a timer to perfectly boil an egg for 15 minutes. How would you do it? So to do it, you've got to look at 7 and 11. You can't just turn over a 7 twice. It would be 14, right? And you can't just turn over 11 and then use 7 after that, or you're at 18. How could you do this? So you're looking at it, what kind of combination between 7, 11, add, subtract, whatever, to get 15 that would equal 15? And the answer is 11 minus 7 is 4. 11 plus 4 is 15. So first, you're going to have to, the 7-minute and the 11-minute hourglass, you're going to turn them over at the same time. When the 7-minute hourglass is finished, you put your egg on, because there are 4 minutes left in that 11-minute hourglass. And once that's out, you put there are 4 minutes left because you already ran out 7. Then you put 11 down again. And now you're going to have the 15 minutes perfectly, because you have the 4 minutes remained on the 7, and you have another 11-minute hourglass that you would turn over again. So that is the way that would work with selective combination. There's a third source of insights called selective comparison. It's the ability to compare new problems with old information, or with problems that you may have already solved or you are familiar with. An example in the textbook was the hat rack problem, if you remember that, and where participants are going to have to build a structure that can support an overcoat, a hanger for an overcoat in the middle of a room. There's nothing. Imagine a room empty, and they're going to give you 2x4s or sticks and a C-clamp. The 2x4 will not reach the ceiling, so you've got 2 2x4s. How would you solve it? This isn't a really difficult problem, but it just kind of tells you that selective comparison. You know, most people, I think, could figure this out pretty quickly. And the picture is, of course, take those 2 sticks together, wedge them together, use the C-clamp to pull them together, frame it on the wall, and, of course, use that C-clamp as the hook to make that hat rack. So, I think of even a better example. I was getting my oil changed at the BMW dealership. It was been about a year and a half or so ago. And when I was sitting there, I was on my laptop and I see this big 18-wheeler pull underneath. They had an overhang in the car dealership, and the exhaust from the front of that big 18-wheel truck that was carrying stuff in the back went right through the middle overhang. And I just heard this loud scratching. And of course, everyone freaking out like, oh my gosh, what's going on? And I look over and I'm just watching the chaos. And I see these guys, they are, and think about how do you solve this problem? They are looking at these big mounts. They were either going to push up this roof, but what they decided to do is to get a hacksaw. And I see them get in the truck and they're grabbing something. They come out and they're about to saw this exhaust, the two exhaust pipes from this 18-wheeler to get the truck back out. And I was just looking at it and I walked out there and I said, you're about 4 inches to, that you hit it. All you have to do is take the air out of your front tires and just put it in reverse. And they were just kind of blown away that they didn't think about that. They didn't have to cut and do all that stuff. That is selective comparison, using information you already know to solve a problem. So barriers to problem solving. Just as there's many methods to solve problems, there are also a lot of different factors that can interfere with successful problem solving. And we're going to look at just a couple of those things now. First off, fixations. That's one of the most important barriers to problem solving. It's the tendency to kind of get hung up or on wrong solutions or become too blind to alternatives. Sometimes when we know too much about something, this does occur. And it occurs a lot of times without giving it any thought. We just place unnecessary restrictions on our thinking. For example, think about this. And if you had 4 trees, and this is the example in the book, if you recall, or if you have your book, and you need to plant these 4 trees in equal distance apart from one another, how would you do it? So if you're thinking about that, 4 trees, how could you make sure that every single one is from equal distance? Because if you just put them in a square, the 2 diagonal are going to be 1.5 times further than the one right next to them, correct? So they're not equal distance. So how would you do it? And that's where we get hung up on these 2-dimensional thoughts in our mind, and we're not thinking more in this 3-dimensional thinking or creative thinking. And of course, with here, between 2 of the trees, they put a hill and they put the 4th tree on top. So now all 4 are exactly the same distance away from one another. And that's kind of the example they used for that problem. And that is trying to solve a problem on fixation, when we're fixated on the wrong thing. Another thing is the functional fixedness is what they call it. It's a tendency to perceive an item only in terms in its most common use. So if you've ever, had a screw that you're trying to get out and you don't have a screwdriver and you used a dime for it or a penny for it, you know exactly what, functional fixedness, or being able to be creative to make something else work that wasn't designed to make it work that way, but it does work. And that's how functional fixedness, and if you don't have it, if you're fixated just you have to have a screwdriver, that's going to affect your problem solving. So there's another thing in the book that they talk about, and it's a pretty famous experiment. It's called the candle problem. It's to really look at someone's creativity. And this was, of course, done many years ago, but it's, again, Carl Dunker. He asked his same students in his class to mount a candle on a vertical wall so the candle could burn normally. So the candle had to be, on a vertical wall to burn normally. And so what he did, he gave them, each student, you see it on the slide there, 3 candles, some matches, cardboard boxes, some thumbtacks, other items that you see on there like tape and some other stuff that he put in there. And half of the group, what he did was he put all those items inside the box. In the other half, he put the boxes out empty and put all of those items on the table and spread them out on that tabletop. And what he found out is very interesting, that when the items were in the boxes, they didn't understand how to do it because they didn't think of the box as part of the solution. They thought the box was just holding the items that they're supposed to use. This is kind of where you get that thought. I believe this is where it came from, where out of the box idea. You have to think out of the box. You can't be in the box and thinking that way. So, but when he had everything spread out on the counter and the box was separate, it kind of helped with the creative thinking because they weren't fixated on the box as a container. They thought this is a box and it could be part of the solution. So how do you do that? How do you use the items there? And what the solution is, oh, and there's the 3 candles, matches, cardboard boxes, and thumbtacks. There were a lot of the stuff that really wasn't needed for this experiment. Could have maybe helped it, but really wasn't necessary. But was to take the cardboard box or one of the cardboard boxes, but used a thumbtack to hold it up, took the candle, lit the candle, used the wax, and set the candle on top of this box. And that was the solution to this problem. And one thing that's very interesting too, there are a lot of 5-year-olds that have been tested. They can solve these problems a lot easier than someone that has a lot of life experience, because the 5-year-old really doesn't have a lot of signs of functional fixedness, they call it. And because they've had less experience to use certain objects, so all of it's new, or they're novel ideas or concepts, so they're not so fixated on what the box is supposed to be used for, if you look at it that way. Other common barriers to problem solving, functional fixedness we just talked about is just one of the mental blocks that prevent insight. Emotional barriers that inhibits us. It gives us a fear of making a fool of ourselves, or fear of making a mistake, our inability to tolerate ambiguity, excessive self-criticism. Those kind of things can be barriers to help us solve problems, that are having solutions to these problems. And there's a lot of different examples in the book. I'm going to kind of move along fast here and move to some other things. There's also some cultural barriers that could come into play, and learn barriers. Read about this in your book, about the meanings and possibilities, taboos that are cross-cultural differences. So there's and then there's a perceptual barrier that are habits leading to the failure to identify important elements of a problem, because we're used to doing something a certain way that we're not thinking that it actually can be done another way, like driving to someone's house. Once you've gone that way, not realizing there may be a quicker way, but you're used to driving that same way every single time. So the problem solving of experts versus novices. Probably not surprising that experts, of course, can typically generate solutions to a problem much more quickly than novices, and that they're better able to come up with solutions to problems that are slightly outside the boundaries of their expertise. But how does expertise help to explain these differences in really problem solving? You might think that experts just exhibit very different cognitive processes than novices, but it's not really the case. It doesn't seem to be the case. Instead, important key to the expert's superior performance seems to reside in the amount of prior knowledge held in their long-term memory and the way that knowledge is organized. So differences in the amount of prior knowledge. To understand why having a great deal of prior knowledge is important to problem solving, we start to look at 2 problems. So let's look at there's a woman that has been given a responsibility of putting grass seed down on a football field. The field measures 300 yards by 160 yards wide. She goes online to order the grass seed and sees that 1 large bag of seed is going to cover 10 square yards. How many bags does she need to seed the entire field? So students in a high school art class, here's another example, have decided to paint a large mural on the back wall of their gym. This is similar to the other example. Before they can begin painting the mural, though, they need to have enough white paint to paint the wall. The wall measures 100 feet long by 18 feet high. A large bucket of white paint will cover 900 square feet and cost $100. How much money will they spend to paint the wall? So whenever people are trying to solve this problem, researchers notice that there are 2 key elements of any problem. First has been called surface structure. That surface structure of a problem, it refers to the problem's superficial features. Here, the surface structure of the first problem would be the football fields and grass seed. The second would be the walls and the paint. Then the second element to solve these problems is called deep structure, which refers to the problem's fundamentals. If you look closely at the 2 problems that we just talked about, you notice that while their surface structure is different, the deep structure is actually the same. Stripping away superficial surface features of problems, people who have some experience with high school math are quickly going to recognize that solving both of these problems require that you begin by calculating the area of a rectangle, very basic, to determine the amount that needs to be purchased. It's probably not going to surprise you to know that while surface structure is always easy to see, deep structure is not. Our attention is often captured by the superficial aspects of a problem, why its underlying fundamentals are harder to spot. However, our understanding of a particular topic increases. That is, as our prior knowledge accumulates, it's going to increase. And that's the ability to see a problem's deep structure. It improves considerably. Evidence for experts' ability to better recognize deep structure comes from a classic study carried out with novices. It was undergraduate physics students, and experts, which were graduate students and professors. It was back in 1981. The participants read a series of physics problems and were asked to determine how to best sort them. The basis for the groupings of novices and experts showed important differences. Novices were clearly focused on the surface structure of the problem, typically sorting based on the objects pictured in the problem, like springs, inclined planes, pulleys. In contrast, experts were much more likely to sort the problem using deep structure as a guide. Specifically, their categories focused on the laws of physics that were relevant to the solution. That's an important thing to know. It needs to be relevant to the solution. That's a conservation of energy, Newton's second law, gravity. Regardless of the objects that were described in the problem, they were focused on what was the relevant solution. So there are at least two helpful consequences that stem from the expert's ability to see deep structure of a problem. The first is that a better understanding of a person's fundamentals allows experts to focus on the most relevant aspects of the problem, ignoring details that are unlikely to be helpful. They ignore those details. The second is that a good understanding of deep structure allows experts to transfer their knowledge. That is, they're better able to see fundamental similarities between problems that look different on the surface. Recognizing similarities in deep structure, thus it allows experts to recognize when solutions developed for one problem may effectively be used to manage another. Fixated on the more superficial elements of a problem, novices are unlikely to see how the two problems that appear different on the surface are related and how the solution to one might transfer to another. There are also, just a quick thing on differences in organization and of prior knowledge. It makes sense that experts have more prior knowledge than novices in a particular area. However, research also suggests that this prior knowledge is organized differently in our long-term memories that we talked about in the last chapter of these experts as compared to novices. So consider the results. There were early research carried out, and this is many years ago, 40 years ago, and it's been replicated a few times. In the studies, chess grandmasters and novices were shown a chessboard with the pieces set up to represent the middle of a realistic game. The participants were given a few minutes to study the board before it was removed from sight. They were given an empty board and asked to recreate the arrangement of pieces that had just been seen. The results clearly demonstrate that the grandmasters were much better able than novices to replicate the board in sight. So let's move to unit number 3, which is an intuition, decision-making, and cognitive bias. You don't have to be a genius to experience flashes of insight. In fact, most people frequently experience intuition. That is a quick, impulsive thought that's connected to an automatic or experiential processing, that we discussed at the beginning. For example, think back to your least favorite teacher. Not your psychology professor, of course, but how long did you take to figure out that he or she wasn't going to make the list of your favorite teachers or star teachers? Psychologist Nalani Ambady once asked people to watch video clips of teachers. This was interesting, of teachers they didn't even know. After watching 3 10-second segments, participants were asked to rate the teachers. What was amazing is their ratings actually correlated highly. They were almost identical to the year-end correlations of each one of these, of the students, of those teachers. They also attained, and they pushed it, they also find out that even a thinner kind of slice of that video in just 3 2-second clips That's just 6 seconds is all it took. That participants, that's all they needed to form intuitive judgments of the instructor's teaching. That's amazing. If you remember Malcolm Gladwell's book in 2005, he said it's not a case of hurried irrationality. Instead, it's this called thin slicing, or quickly making a sense of slivers of our experience, such as our intuitive reactions, and trusting those reactions. It's the power of our cognitive unconscious, which is part of the brain that does automatic experiential processing. So it uses all the experiences, and we're picking up on so many different things and senses that if we trust that, we're usually making the right decision. It's far from being irrational. That intuition is really an important part of how we think. Sometimes then, this rapid intuitive judgment also can be very accurate and more reflective than rational consideration. Sometimes when we're using rational consideration, we often are making it fit, especially in relationships. When we know at the very beginning, we think, hey, this person isn't right for us, but you continue anyway, you start to look for reasons why that person could fit. And that's where the problems are. So that first judgment, that intuition is usually very accurate. The trick is figuring out when you can trust that intuition and when you can't. Have you ever had, like using a teacher's example, a teacher that you really didn't think you were going to like and you ended up liking, after the fact or after the course was finished, or a friend that you didn't think you would like when you first met that person, but you end up really hitting it off and being great friends. These are really some of the ways where your intuition and experiential processing of that data can really lead you astray when you're trying to make decisions. So they're called errors and biases in our intuition and decision making. And it suggests there's at least two factors. Of course, there's not just one, there's always at least two or three that contribute to the poor decision making. And the first is called hot cognition, or thinking that is driven by emotions. So just think of that word, hot cognition, as being driven by emotions. Our emotional reactions to various possibilities can determine what intuitively seems to be the right answer. Emotions like fear, hope, anxiety, liking, someone, or being disgusted, it's going to either eliminate the possibilities for consideration, or it's going to make them look good to be top of the list of consideration for your decision-making process. For many people, choosing, I've talked about politics before, if you're looking at who the politician is the best to vote for in the upcoming election, that's really your emotions come into play and really affect your thinking, rather than comparing candidates' records, which would be a better way to make the right decision on policies when you're comparing their policies. And we're always tempted to vote for someone that we like rather than the person who's the most qualified for the job. Indeed, it's usually better to cool down a bit before you decide to pick that kind of fight. Running off, eloping with someone because you think that they're amazing, or immediately declining a job because you think they're not going to allow you the opportunity to work from home, for instance, may be the wrong thing to do. So it just said, take the time and when you're processing a decision to get all the facts and try to consider it, but also realize that your intuition is a very big part of that. Personal rituals, if you have this negative feeling or you have this gut reaction to possibly your, this emotion when it's negative specifically, you need to calm down before you make a decision on how you're going to react to that. And usually having that cool off, counting to 10 or walking away from a situation before you start acting becomes very important. There's a second factor that contributes to poor decision making, which is rooted in the fact that automatic processing sometimes lead to irrational choices. There were two psychologists they talk about in the book, how they managed information and make decisions, how we make decisions in the face of uncertainty. Their findings strongly suggest that human judgment is often seriously flawed. In particular, they discovered that people who routinely engage in unconscious automatic processing when making decisions, rather than slower, more deliberative, reflective processing, are actually making more errors in their decision-making process. That's a type of experiential thinking, and it often leads to illogical decision-making. Important thing to kind of remember there. Through their initial research, even though it focused on everyday thinking, their research also has been adopted by economists. who examined their findings in relationship to our choices about buying and selling items. And that application of this research resulted in, if you've heard about behavioral economics, that's actually the discipline that came off of that study in behavioral economics in 2015. Traditional economic theories assume that decisions about buying and selling were based on careful weighing of the available options. But this very deliberate decision making, they reasoned, should lead to rational and logical decisions that properly reflected the cost and benefit analysis. However, with these findings, it actually suggested that behavioral economics made it clear that how we think about money and our decisions about what to spend it on aren't rational at all. They're very emotional. And they actually received a Nobel Prize for Economics in 2002 for the early findings of this, to recognize their contribution to the research in 2015, 2016 to understand consumer behavior. But let's look at a couple of decision-making errors that they actually brought up that are common, so we can better be prepared to avoid these errors. And we're going to focus on 4, and it's framing effects, availability, representativeness, and ignoring the odds. Framing. Framing is the most general conclusion about intuition, is that a way a problem is stated or how it's framed affects our decisions. Important to know that for the test. To gain some additional insights into framing, try thinking about a problem like this. A couple is about to divorce, and their parents, and they're seeking custody of their only child, but custody can only be granted to just one parent. So if you had to make a decision based on the following information, to which parent would you give custody to the child? So let's think about parent A. Average income, average health, average working hours, reasonable rapport with the child, relatively stable social life. Parent B. Above average income, minor health problems, lots of work-related travel all the time, but very close relationship with the child, extremely active social life too. Who would you award that? If you were the judge, who would you award the child to? Most people actually award custody to parent B, the parent who has some of the drawbacks, but also several huge advantages, like income, and their relationship, of course. That's because people tend to look for positive qualities that can be awarded to the child. So those are the positive qualities. When we're saying those are the positive things, and the negative of just saying average, average, average are not positive qualities. However, who would you choose if you were asked this question? Let's look at a different example. Given the same characteristics, which parent should be denied custody? In this case, most people choose to deny custody to parent B. Why is parent B a good choice, one moment, and a poor choice the next? It's because the second question was framed differently than the first. It's asking who should be denied custody. To answer that question, people would tend to look for negative qualities that would disqualify a parent. As you can see, the way a question is framed can channel us down a narrow path that we should attend to only part of the information provided rather than reflectively weighing all the pros and cons. This is where attorneys very, very good at, and they understand that framing is such a big part on how they ask questions. Usually the broadest way of framing or stating a problem produces the best decisions. However, people often state problems in increasingly narrow terms until a single seemingly obvious answer emerges. For example, to select a career, it'd be wise to consider pay, working condition, job satisfaction, needed skills, future employment, outlook, and many other factors. Instead, most people have a narrow mind of thinking about such thoughts like, I like to write, so I'll be a journalist or an author. I want to make good money, and being an attorney pays well. Or I love being creative, so maybe I'll be a photographer because I love taking photos. Framing decisions so narrowly greatly increases the risk of making a poor choice. If you would like to think more critically and analytically, it's important to pay attention to how you're defining, that is, how you're framing the problem before you try to solve them. Remember, the shortcuts to answers often short-circuit clear thinking. The other thing is availability. That's the availability heuristic. If we were to ask you which is more frequent, gun-related homicides or gun-related suicides, what would you say? When faced with this question, most people are going to say homicides, and they would be wrong. In fact, suicides involving guns have exceeded homicides for more than 2 decades in the U.S., and not by a small margin. Then why are there so many people prone to estimate it incorrectly? The answer lies in decision-making bias called the availability heuristic. Essentially, when asked to estimate the likelihood or frequency of an event, we begin with a search of our long-term memory. If we can readily bring many instances of the event to mind, we assume that it must occur often and be quite likely. Now that you may be thinking that biases related to the availability heuristic probably don't matter much, after all, does anyone really care about whether you know the statistics on gun violence? Consider another example. This one closer to home, literally. In a well-known study, couples were asked to estimate their contribution to household work, including things like taking out the garbage, cleaning the house, or caring for young children. Consistently, partners estimate that their own contributions total more than 100%, while estimates of their partner's efforts were much less. Why would that be? Using what we know about the availability heuristic, it seems likely that people in the study were very conscious of the work they had done. As a result, instances of their own contributions to the household chores were quickly and easily retrieved from memory. Recalling situations in which the partner had done work, however, was likely more difficult, sometimes because they weren't always there to see it, of course. This lesson, to kind of take away then is when you're involved with any sort of like a team at work, it's always worth stepping back. If you feel like you're the one doing all the work and it's not fair, you're doing all this kind of stuff, chances are it's very likely that members of your team are doing work that you haven't noticed. There's a reasonable chance that many of them are feeling just as overworked as you are. So that's the availability heuristic, the availability of information. Next, we talk about representativeness. Another common pitfall to decision making is illustrated by the classic, what they call the Linda problem. That's Tversky and Kahneman, 1983. And here's a short description of Linda. She's 31 years old, single, outspoken, and very bright. She majored in philosophy. As a student, she was deeply concerned with issues of discrimination and social justice, and also participated in anti-nuclear demonstrations. Given what you know about Linda, which alternative is more probable? Either A, Linda is a bank teller, or B, Linda is a bank teller and is active in the feminist movement. So which one would you select? Of course, most people, they always see B as more probable than A, and the tendency to do so is a powerful one. According to these researchers, the conclusion is based on the representativeness heuristic. That is, we tend to give choice greater weight if it seems to be similar to what we already know. In this case, Linda certainly seems like she could be involved in a feminist movement. Her actions are representative of other people we know who endorse feminism. Therefore, B might seem more likely than A, even though it logically can't be. Consider now that the tendency to make a decision based on representativeness leads to completely illogical conclusions. Namely, the intuitive answer B overlooks an important fact. The likelihood of two events occurring together, this and that, must be lower than the probability of either one alone. For example, the probability of getting one head when flipping a coin is 1/2, or of course 0.5. And it's higher than the probability of getting one head and another head or two heads in a row, 1/4 or 0.25. Logically then, A, Linda is a bank teller, must be more likely than B, Linda is a bank teller and she is active in the feminist movement. See how that works? When decision making is unknowingly based on representativeness, the results can be disastrous. In courtrooms, for example, jurors are more likely to think that a defendant is guilty if the person appears to fit the profile of a person likely to commit a crime. Very scary. For example, a young single man from a poor neighborhood would be more likely to be judged guilty of theft than a middle-aged married father from an affluent suburb. So, of course, now we have ignoring the odds. Another common error in intuitive judgment involves ignoring the base rate, the odds, or underlying probability of an event. People in one experiment were told that they would be given descriptions of 100 people, 70 lawyers, and 30 engineers. Participants were then asked to guess without knowing anything about a person whether he or she was an engineer or a lawyer. All correctly stated the probabilities of 70% for lawyer and 30% for engineer. Participants were then given this description. Eric is a 30-year-old man. He's married with no children, a man of high ability and high motivation. He promises to be quite successful in his field. He is well liked by his colleagues. Quickly now, what are the odds Eric is a lawyer or an engineer? Notice that the description gives no new information about Eric's occupation. He could still be either an engineer or a lawyer. Therefore, the odds should again be estimated as 70-30. However, most people change the odds to 50-50. It's not 50-50, it's still 70-30. Intuitively, it seems that Eric has an equal chance of being either an engineer or a lawyer or attorney, but this guess completely ignores the underlying odds or that base rate of 70-30. Does it make sense? Perhaps it's fortunate that we do ignore underlying odds at times. Were this not the case, how many people would get married in the face of a 50% divorce rate? Or how many would start high-risk businesses? On the other hand, people who smoke, drink, and then drive, or take drugs, or skip wearing seatbelts, ignore rather high odds of injury or illness. In many high-risk situations, ignoring base rates is the same as thinking that you're an exception to the rule, which is very rarely the case. Just quick knowledge checks. You can read that on your own. And I'm going to move to Unit 4, which is creative thinking. Original ideas have changed the course of human history. Much of what now is taken for granted in art, medicine, music, technology, and science, it was once regarded as radical or impossible. What is it that defines a creative thinker? The nature of creativity. We saw earlier in the chapter that problem solving is based on, could be algorithms or understanding or insight. Routine problem solving usually requires logical, convergent thinking. That's where the lines are thought to converge on the answer. There's one correct answer and the problem is to find it. In contrast, creativity is the ability to combine mental elements in new and useful ways. Let's take a closer look at each one of these characteristics, the two characteristics of creative individuals, which is divergent thinking and problem finding. Convergent problems, if we look at it, what is the area of a single triangle that is 3 feet wide at the base and 2 feet tall? Here's another problem. Erica is shorter than Zoe, but taller than Carlo. And Carlo is taller than Jared. Who's the second tallest? It's part of a convergent thinking or a convergent problem. If you simultaneously drop a baseball and bowling ball from a tall building, which will hit the ground first? Now let's talk about divergent problems. And here's a problem. What objects can you think of that begin with the letters BR? How could discarded aluminum cans be put to use? This is divergent problems that require divergent problem thinking, creative thinking. Write a poem about fire and ice. This is divergent thinking. Divergent thinking is creative ideas are usually best achieved through, of course, divergent thinking, in which many possibilities are developed from one starting point. We can purposely try to engage in divergent thinking when we try to solve problems, but it's also a characteristic of daydreaming, like vivid waking fantasies that are often associated with greater mental flexibility and creativity. Divergent thought tends to be intuitive and associative, whereas problem solving is usually conscious, reflective processing activity. Creativity is more likely involving apparently unconscious experiential processing. Let me say that again. Divergent thought tends to be intuitive and associative, whereas problem solving is usually consciously reflective of processing activity. Creativity more likely involves apparently unconscious experiential processing. In addition, divergent thinking involves fluency, flexibility, and originality. For example, let's say that you would like to find creative uses for the billions of plastic containers that are discarded every year. The creativity of your suggestions could be rated in this way. Fluency is defined as the total number of suggestions that you're able to make. Flexibility is the number of times that you shift from one class of possible uses to another. Originality refers to how novel or unusual your ideas are. By counting the number of times that you showed fluency, flexibility, and originality, we could rate your capacity for creative, divergent thinking. Isn't creativity more than divergent thought? Well, if a person comes up with a large number of useless answers to a problem, good question. I mean, divergent thinking is an important part of creativity, but there's more to it. To be creative, this is important. To be creative, the solution to a problem must be more than novel, unusual, or original. It must also be high quality and relevant to solving the original problem. This is the dividing line between harebrained schemes and a stroke of genius. In other words, creative people bring reasoning and critical thinking to bear on new ideas once they're produced. So that, in fact, that's what the best creative solution to a problem must be relevant. Problem finding. Problem finding is a second characteristic of creative thinkers. Many of the problems we solve are presented to us by employers, teachers, circumstances, or life in general. Problem finding involves actively seeking problems to solve. I think Richard Branson once said, if you want to be a very successful person, find a problem that affects a large group of people and solve it, and you will be successful. He said very wealthy. You're more likely to find unsolved problems and also choose how you're going to tackle them. Thus, problem finding may be more creative act than convergent problem solving that typically follows it. So think about that for thought. How to measure creativity. In the next chapter, we're going to really get into intelligence and some of the measurements. And one thing that we're going to find that measuring creativity is a difficult process. And we're going to try to do that. Just do a little test here. You may have done this in the book or looked at it, but you probably didn't give it a lot of thought. So divergent thinking can be measured in several ways. In the unusual uses test, there is a test that Kaufman in 2009 came up with. It was then redone, I think, a few years later. You could be asked to think of as many uses as possible for some object, such as like the plastic containers I've just mentioned in the last slide. In the consequences test, you would list the consequences that would follow a basic change in the world. For example, you may be asked, what would happen if everyone suddenly lost the sense of balance and can no longer stay upright? People try to list as many reactions as possible. Even if you were to take an anagrams test, you would be given a word such as creativity and asked to make as many new words as possible by rearranging the letters. Each of these tests can be scored for fluency, flexibility, and originality. So are you a divergent or a creative thinker? Let's find out. I'm going to show you 3 illustrations, and I want you to write down what you see. Label it A, B, and C. Do it now because we're going to actually go on to something else and come back to it. So I need you to remember this to see if you're actually a divergent or creative thinker. And then we're going to go through 6 of them in total, but let's go ahead and look at it. So first, here is illustration A. I want you to write down what you see. Just write it down. You can even kind of draw it real quick on a piece of paper. Write down what you see. Ready for the next one? Here's illustration B. What do you see? Write down what you see. This isn't a Rorschach test, so don't worry. We're not looking for abnormalities in your personality. We're just seeing if you're a creative thinker or how you think. And then the third one we're going to look at, here's an illustration. Label it illustration C. Draw it real quick. What do you see? What does that look like to you? All right. Next, I'm going to show you these 3 illustrations. What I want you to do is complete the drawings. And the top one is drawing 1. The middle one's drawing 2. The third one is drawing 3. So go ahead and replicate that and finish the drawing on what it looks like or what it could be. And go ahead and pause this video real quick and write out how you would finish these drawings. Now let's look at the uniqueness. We're going to look at an ordinary response of each one and the uniqueness and kind of compare the two. So we're going to start in this upper left-hand corner. If you look at illustration A, the drawing of the horizontal line with the vertical lines and the 4 circles, a common response, people would say a table with things on top or something like that. A unique could be a foot with 4 toes or something, something that's not just an obvious table with things on top. So if you answered and put on there, write down if you were unique or you were a common answer, more common. And it's okay to be common. Illustration B. If you look at this one here with the 5 circles at the top of with this vertical line, a common response is a flower, a windmill, something like that. Unique response is like a lollipop bursting into pieces. So something that have action or a more descriptive explanation of what you actually saw. And now let's look at illustration 3 with the 2 semicircles. A common response are 2 igloos. So unique responses, 2 haystacks on a flying carpet, something like that. Of course, we're looking for the adjectives, the descriptive words, something that's unique. That's what we're looking for to see if someone is a creative. And let me tell you, there are certain jobs and you think, wow, I'm not very creative. Don't worry about that, because many jobs, they don't want you to be completely creative. That creativity could be good in some jobs, but I would say most jobs, they would prefer you to be more of a traditional, ordinary thinker where you're not always trying to change things, So it just depends on the employer, the culture, and the position that you're applying for. So let's look at these pictures. So if you see on the left-hand side, we started with like a Z, and you kind of see an ordinary response if you're just kind of drawing something with the Z. But if you can see like a wine glass or, martini or whatever, if you see something different, then that really shows creativity and that divergent thinking. With this next picture with the arrow, if you just made it look like a triangle or diagonal or something like that, that's more ordinary, very common. But if you draw something unique, and this is an arrow pointing to, I don't know exactly what this is. I think that's like a farming type house or something, or it could be a spaceship. That's more creative, or things like that. And then the third one with this line here, a jagged line that looks like lightning. If you drew lightning or a mountain, that could be more ordinary. But if you drew something that has edges and converge from, making it look like a graphite end of a pencil or something else, it's more creative. And creative responses are more original and more complex. There's good and bad about both, but it just is a quick test to see about your creativity. But you see how hard that is, because creativity is definitely a form of intelligence that not everyone has. Some people are great at IQ tests, but when you get to creativity and the motivation, things like that, that are really a big part of that intelligence, overall intelligence, it's very difficult to measure. So let's look at stages of creative thought. Does creative thinking actually have a pattern? There are 5 stages that occur during creative problem solving. The first stage is orientation. The first step, a person identifies or defines the problem and identifies its most important dimensions. And then the second step is preparation. It helps to be prepared in general, as an expert might be when first confronting a problem, but it also helps to become saturated with as much information about the specific problem as possible. The third step is incubation. Most major problems will have a period during which you attempt solutions that are going to fail. At this point, problem solving may proceed on a subconscious level. Although the problem seems to have been set aside, it's still kind of cooking in the background. You're still working on it, but you're incubating, you're thinking about, you're in deep thought about the solution to this problem. Then the fourth is illumination. That is after incubation stage, it's often ended by a rapid insight or series of insights. These produce kind of the aha moment or experience, often depicted in cartoons like a light bulb clearing over someone's head. And then finally, we have the 5th stage, verification. And this is the final step, and it's to test and critically evaluate the solution obtained during the illumination stage. If the solution proves to be faulty, then you have to go back to incubation and start thinking about it again. So perhaps the greatest misconception of this creative process is that it's all about the flash of an illumination. But, just like Thomas Edison once remarked, he said, genius is 1% inspiration and 99% perspiration. Many hours of orientation, preparation can be overshadowed by the brilliance of an aha illumination. Also, much creative problem solving is incremental. That is, it's at the end result of many small steps and years of work and preparation. And it's certainly true of many inventions which were built on even other people's earlier ideas. Some psychologists believe that truly exceptional creativity requires a rare combination of thinking skills, personality, and this is interesting, a supportive social environment. This is part of and I did not write that, that's in the book, but I have some research published on social support and the importance for building a successful small business. And so I was really happy to see that in the book. This mix, they believe, accounts for creative giants such as like Leonardo da Vinci, Sigmund Freud, Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart. So the creative personality, what makes someone creative? According to the popular stereotype, highly creative people are eccentric, introverted, neurotic, socially inept, unbalanced in their interest, and on the edge, frankly, of madness. After all, isn't there a fine line between genius and insanity? In general, direct studies of creative individuals suggest that such characteristics are kind of a stereotype and not always accurate. It can be, but not always. However, research offered the following findings with respect to creativity. Creativity and test scores, which measure divergent thinking, that creativity, and IQ scores, which measure convergent thinking, are weakly correlated with one another. Think about that. Creativity, test scores, and IQ are weak. They're correlated, but very, very weakly. Highly creative people are not necessarily what they consider to be highly intelligent, and that's using the operational definition with IQ tests, that convergent thinking, and it's vice versa, which, really think about it. It doesn't mean one's more intelligent than the other. They're just different forms of intelligence. Creative people usually have a greater than average range of knowledge and interest. They're more fluent in combining ideas from various sources. They're also good at using mental images and metaphors and thinking. Creative people are open to a wide variety of experiences. They accept irrational thoughts and are uninhibited about their feelings and fantasies. They tend to use broad categories, question assumptions, and break mental sets. They find order in chaos. They also experience more unusual states of consciousness, such as like lucid dreams, mystical experiences, things like that. Creative people enjoy symbolic thought, ideas, concepts, and possibilities. They tend to be interested in truth, form, and beauty, rather than fame and success. Their creative work is, in the end, itself. Creative people value their independence and prefer complexity. However, they're unconventional and non-conforming primarily in their work. Otherwise, they don't have unusual, outlandish, or bizarre personalities. So can creativity, the question becomes, can that be learned? Can you teach someone how to become creative? And it's actually starting to look like that some of these creative thinking skills can be learned or tweaked. Everyone has a bit of creativity. Even if you don't think you're creative, it's there. In particular, you can become more creative maybe by practicing divergent thinking, this newness, and taking risks, asking unusual questions, analyzing ideas, and seeking odd connections between ideas. To learn more about, if you want to develop your creative side, they do have a part in the book in the chapters on psychology and your skill set that you can take a look at, but it's very, very interesting. So here was just a few things you can consider. We're running out of time, so I'm going to leave it at that. Just a couple of food for thought. And let's get to the last unit, number 5, psychology and your skill set on creativity and innovation and the DNA of innovation. What makes up innovation? At a time when the world's becoming more complex, with no doubt, it's no surprise that creativity and innovative thinking are increasingly seen as valuable skills in the workforce. These skills are considered an important aspect of problem solving at many organizations, but nurturing your creative side can have benefits for your personal life as well. In fact, research indicates that people who engage in creative pursuits in their leisure time, at least, even if at work you can't, but if you do it in your leisure time, get out of the box and think about ways to be creative, they're happier and show higher levels of well-being. Makes you want to become creative. So how can creative, innovative thinking be fostered? It's exactly what the international team of researchers asked when they spent 6 years interviewing some of the most innovative people in the world. This was done about 10 years ago. They found out that these people demonstrated 4 key discovery skills which they described in the Innovator's DNA Project. The good news, the discovery skills can be cultivated by anyone who's willing to practice them. And we'll take a look. Let's look real quick about what those 4 skills are. The first one is make associations. Associating refers to the ability to connect ideas, questions, or concepts that at first glance seem to be completely unrelated. Dyer, Gregerson, and Christensen pointed out that such unusual connections are easier to make when you've had diverse experiences or when you work with people who have had diverse experiences. So you need to ask questions. Being creative also includes willingness to challenge conventions and refusal to accept the status quo. This means that you should often be asking your questions such as why or why not, what if. Ven Phillips provides a good example of someone who understands the value of pushing back against conventional wisdom in the book. He didn't accept, for example, that existing prosthetics were as good as they could be. And if you remember the picture in the book, he created prosthetic legs, and he said, why does this prosthetic leg have to look like a human's? Why not? Why couldn't it look like a cheetah's? And if you've seen these Olympic runners and stuff, or people even on skis and snowboarders that have amputations, that you see kind of the frame of the leg that is metallic, but it looks and angled more like an animal's than a human's. Here's a mental set problem. So if you look at both of these problems, on the left, there are 9 dots that are arranged in a square. Can you connect them by drawing 4 continuous straight lines without lifting your pencil from the paper? So just write these 9 dots and see if you can make 4 continuous lines, connecting every single one of the lines without crossing another. Can you do it? And then there's 6 matches. You have to arrange these to make 4 triangles. The triangles must be the same size, with each side equal to the length of one match. Can you do that? Can you be innovative? Let's look at what the answers are. If you want to continue it and try it on your own, pause the video, but let's look at the answers. So the first solution, of course, this just tells us we can do it, and you may have seen this, it's been around forever, but it's to think outside the box, that you could do it as long as you move outside of that box. And the reason they put the box there is to try to keep you from thinking that way. But you can do it, but you can't do it with conventional wisdom. You have to think outside the box. And then, of course, the matches is more 3D. You can easily create it by having them stand upright on their edges. If you want the DNA of innovation, seek varied input through networking. If making associations and questioning are important in boosting creativity, then it's worth noting that both of these skills can be enhanced when you regularly exchange ideas with a wide variety or range of people. Networking with diverse others can help you consider new questions that might ask to challenge the status quo. You can also assist you in making new associations between ideas that first seem unrelated. For example, in the book, they said Sarah Deer has championed the idea of bringing together diverse professionals in an effort to investigate potential reforms to justice system that would provide greater assistance to Native American women who are victims of abuse. So that example in the book and many others you could think about really tell us about the importance of having a diverse and equitable, belonging environment and work culture and school culture, wherever we are, that it's so important. It's not just the right thing to do. It also is going to help you create different ideas and become more innovative in your thinking and, quite frankly, more profitable for a business aspect as well. There's another thing, the essence of brainstorming, brainstorming here, is that producing and evaluating ideas are kept separate. This encourages the kind of divergent thinking that is promoted when you work with people who have different experiences. In group problem solving, each person is encouraged to produce as many ideas as possible without fear of criticism. So what I do whenever I have my office brainstorming sessions, each person would take their own time to talk about in their department, the department heads, about what they're working on, and they're going to throw out and have ideas without recourse. We're not going to criticize, but we're all brainstorming to help find the best ways to accomplish certain tasks. And that's important in any work environment, to brainstorm. But the importance of brainstorming is not to be criticized or use the information from those sessions in a way that could be negative or have negative repercussions. Or brainstorming quite frankly, it doesn't work. Also, the ideas have to be freely generated. There's a cross stimulation effect that takes place in which one participant ideas may trigger someone else's. That happens all the time in brainstorming. So can this brainstorming be applied to individual problem solving? Of course. That's why, it's in the book. The essential point to remember is to suspend judgment. Creative ideas should first be produced without regard for logic, organization, accuracy, practicality, and I'll even say profitability. When you're in an organization and you're trying to brainstorm, try not to think about the things that could get in the way, because what's going to happen if you have someone saying, yeah, that's not going to work because of this, that, and the other. What we do, we have stress balls, and if someone is negative, you can kind of throw them if they're just kind of always thinking about why you can't do something. In these type of creative environments, we're trying to think why we can't do it. Let's think about reasons and ways that we can do something in a different way. The basic rules for successful brainstorming, and they gave us a list in the book, is, of course, just real quickly, do not criticize ideas until later in the session. You can do that later when you're about to look at decision-making process. Then you can have critical thinking. Modify or combine ideas freely. Don't worry about giving credit for ideas, keeping them neat, mix them up. Try to generate a lot of ideas in the early stages, brainstorming, and then funnel them down to the best idea. Let your imagination run wild. Seek unusual, remote, or wild ideas. Record your ideas. Of course, you need to have someone taking notes, or record the meeting and elaborate or improve on the most promising ideas. So we get into observation, observing, and experiment with these ideas. Creative individuals practice their observation skills by watching the behavior of people in their everyday lives, taking note of what they do and say, what frustrates them, what makes them happy. Often this type of observation is combined with the questioning skills that were described earlier. After watching people, you may be inclined to ask yourself, why do they do that? Why do our clients want that? Why do our competitors do it this way? What if they did it in another way? How does what I'm seeing different from what I expected? Or, of course, you may also want to think about taking your observations one step further and saying, of course, I talked about Richard Branson earlier. He's the CEO of Virgin Airlines and other companies, many other companies. He's well known for taking notes about everything he sees in every conversation of interest too. So after observing something interesting and asking questions, you might then attempt to answer those questions in the process of experimentation. If you remember section 1.5 early on, people interested in psychological experiments begin with questions and develop hypotheses around what they believe will happen. Consider approaching the world with this type of hypothesis testing mindset, which encourages you to examine your questions and hypotheses out in the world and watch to see whether the results can conform to your expectations. It's important to recognize that experimenting in this sense isn't necessarily something that's happening in a lab. Anyone can test an idea by simply implementing it and evaluating the consequences. An important thing to remember, those experimenting with ideas can truly be a process of trial and error, and don't be afraid to fail. That's actually, failure is a necessary step to success in many cases. When your ideas don't work, or your hypotheses aren't confirmed, don't get frustrated, don't stay down. Try to establish whether there's anything to be learned from the failure, and then consider how you may use that as you move forward. Thomas and Edison, remarked, haven't failed. I've simply found 10,000 ways that it doesn't work, which is true. Quick self-assessment. Just ask yourself these questions. Read them on the screen. If you're having a problem answering any of these, perhaps you should take some time to review this information again before you take your exam. Make sure you're taking notes. Can't tell you that enough. This is just a summary of what we talked about. I know I went very long today. I apologize, but it was a lot of information, very important. And I hope that you learned something very valuable. Thank you very much for listening. In our next video, we'll record chapter 9 on intelligence. It's a great video. Thank you for listening. Talk to you soon.